Hello wonderful person, welcome to What the Math. This is Anton, and today we're talking about Chinese Space Agency. Now, you don't really hear a lot about Chinese space exploration, but in the last few decades they have not only caught up with the Soviets and the US, but are about to launch a mission that is essentially going to reignite the exploration of the moon and may end up in the construction of a permanent settlement. So let's talk a little bit more about this, and welcome to What the Math. And in this video, we're going to be using Kerbal space program, and I'm going to try to recreate the mission that I'm talking about. Now, this particular mission is going to be launched sometime in late 2020s, and so we still have at least 10 years before the mission starts, but it is going to be super exciting. Now, if you actually want to try this yourself in Kerbal Space Program, it's surprisingly difficult to find realistically looking Chinese rockets, and they're actually not very popular because obviously we wouldn't hear a lot about Chinese space exploration, and normally in the Western media we barely even know what Chinese are up to. But if you live in Asia like I do, you hear about China all the time, and I know very well that they've been up to quite a lot of really exciting missions. Now, China, after all, is actually the third nation to independently put an astronaut in space all by itself, and it's known for several space-related records as well, including the world's largest telescope that is actually going to be finished very soon, and it's going to be in the southwest region of the country. So when it comes to the biggest and most powerful telescopes, it's actually China that has them, not the US. And in this video, we're going to talk about their Long March series of rockets, also known as Chang'e rockets, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, but you know what, that's the best I could do. The Long March actually refers to a kind of a military retreat that was undertaken by the Red Army back in 1934-1935, when they're actually kind of running away from People's Liberation Army, which was back then known as Nationalist China. And all of this was done to try to evade the complete destruction by the so-called Chinese Nationalist Party. And what ended up happening was, after the Long March, the Communist China was able to reestablish itself and eventually prevailed, when not only did they defeat the Chinese Nationalist Party, but ended up basically kicking them off the mainland and onto the island that's today known as Taiwan. But anyway, that's history, and I'm probably going to get in trouble with Chinese government for saying all of this, but whatever. Anyway, moving on. China launched its first satellite, known as Dongfang 1, also known as the East is Red 1, into Earth orbit back in April of 1970. So it's actually quite a long time since their first successful launch. And in the late 90s, they actually started launching quite a lot of rockets, but had several major failures, including 2 failures that resulted in major civilian casualties. Now, at first, they didn't really know what's happening, but an American satellite company shared some information with the Chinese agency, telling them that basically all of their failures were a result of a construction failure, construction weakness that was very easily solved. But because the American company shared this information, the US government got really mad at them and actually ended up suing this company and penalizing them for something like $14 million, which is actually probably the biggest number or the biggest amount that any company had to pay for a similar mistake. And all of this was because sharing such information is technically illegal, and this would essentially help Chinese military develop better weapons. And this is why US was trying to avoid it. But you know what, in the end, it ended up resulting in them improving their space agency and of course making more successful rockets later on. However, following all of these problems, the Chinese program really picked up. In 2003, the first Chinese astronaut made it to space on board the homemade rocket and a homemade spacecraft. And you probably don't even know who that is, but his name was Yang Liwei, and he was actually a pretty exciting person, and obviously still is because he's still alive. And although Western media only briefly reported on this particular achievement, in China a lot of people were very excited, and actually because it was so recent, it reignited the passion for space exploration in the entire Chinese culture, and many kids today actually want to become astronauts, and many kids were even named after this first guy, Yang Liwei. Now, by 2007, something like 100 successful launches have already been completed by the Chinese, and in 2008, they launched 3 astronauts altogether who also performed the first Chinese EVA, basically leaving the spacecraft and exploring space. And even though technically China was about 50 years behind US and USSR in terms of, achievements, they were catching up really fast. And as of today, and specifically I'm talking about late June of 2016, something like 230 various missions have actually been performed. And very recently, they've actually launched a very successful new design known as Long March 7, or Chang'e 7, which basically allows China to now launch satellites using much safer and much cheaper design. And this particular design is actually meant for basically competing with other space agencies. And I think China plans to basically launch something like 70% of future missions using this particular rocket, and so it's going to save China quite a lot of money. But the most exciting rocket, and this is actually what I'm trying to recreate in this particular video, is known as Long March 9. So this rocket is what's known as a super heavy launcher, and essentially it's still being developed, it's not actually out yet. And in some sense, we kind of got to see this rocket in the movie Martian. If you've ever watched the movie, and I don't want to spoil it for you, but in the scene where the Chinese agency launches the American capsule to basically help the astronauts, it's launched using Long March 9, a rocket that still doesn't exist but will exist soon. So this super heavy design will be able to launch up to 140 tons to low Earth orbit, or close to 50 tons to basically land on the moon. And that's really what they're planning to do with this rocket. It's essentially going to return us back to the moon, return people back to the moon, and at some point they're planning to essentially settle and colonize the moon as well. Its first flight is expected in 2025, so for me that's only about 9 years away, and the first landing is expected by 2029. And this would be equivalent to basically Saturn V, or I guess you could also compare it to a less successful N1 designed by the Soviets, which never really flew that well and basically exploded on a launch platform. But the only other super heavy platform we actually have is also Russian. It's known as Energia, and that particular platform launched the Soviet Buran back in, I believe, 1989. But other than Saturn V and Energia, there's actually nothing out there that can launch such huge amount of stuff into space. But obviously NASA actually does have its own design coming as well, and it's going to be coming out in the next 2 years. And this particular design is going to be a little bit less impressive. It's not going to be able to lift as much. And also SpaceX is also planning to have their own super heavy launcher, but none of these compare to how much weight the Chinese version actually can lift and how much payload it can actually deliver to space. And interestingly, unfortunately for China, not that many international clients currently use Chinese launchers, but this actually is mostly for two reasons. One is because US really doesn't want to give China more power and has even made it illegal for US companies to launch anything American made using Chinese rockets. Although one company really was able to kind of finally trick the satellite using Chinese parts and then launching that particular satellite using Chinese rockets and saving millions of dollars. And the second reason is really because Russia, Ukraine, and to some extent France still have a very, very tight hold on most of the essentially satellite markets. So most of the satellites are usually launched using Russian, Ukrainian, and French rockets. However, SpaceX has also been very successful at taking a lot of their clients away. But China, with this new rocket, and specifically here I'm talking about Long March 7 that has and specifically here I'm talking about Long March 7 that just recently had its maiden flight, I believe it was June 28 of 2016 or maybe June 27, to try to take some of the competition back to China and will hopefully give the other space agencies a reason to try to develop a new rocket as well. But all in all though, I personally am really excited to see where China takes us, or takes their own space program that is, and takes us with them in the next few years. And honestly, unlike NASA that literally has a single launch in 2016, China has actually a lot planned, and their goal of going to the moon and settling there is actually really exciting. It's very unfortunate that the US government chose to pursue other goals and instead is focusing on telescopes only, which China is obviously doing as well, but nevertheless, I guess with Chinese space agency and to some extent Indian space agency that's also very successful, we still have quite a lot of exciting things to do in space, and we're hopefully going to return with their space agencies and settle the rest of the moons and planets using their spacecrafts. But anyway, as you watched me land on the moon and actually fail several times because I was actually trying to do it without using any kind of help and any kind of navigational aids, I actually ended up landing on the moon, and it was kind of fun to do using this Chinese-made rocket and also this funny looking moon lander that I just kind of created using stock parts in Kerbal Space Program. Anyway, if you actually want to give this particular mod a try, I posted the link for it in the description below, and also don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to share this video and like it if you've enjoyed or learned something from it. I'll see you guys in the next video where we're going to talk about something else space, math, science related, or possibly play a video game. See you guys in the next video, game you later, and as always, bye bye.